Hey everybody, Matthew here, and welcome to Dharma Talk. If you're listening on the podcast, then everything's the same. If you're listening on YouTube, you notice that this is just an audio recording, and that's just because of some technical difficulties, but we'll be back next week. So let's start with just the announcements and kind of get them out of the way. The course is up, the Intro to Buddhism course. OneMindDharma.com/intro. I've gotten a lot of great feedback. We switched a couple things and added a few pieces, and it's been wonderful to hear the feedback and see what people are learning and what they find useful. You can check it out. It has hours and hours of video. I spent a lot of time, and because it's a great passion of mine, researching and organizing and creating outlines and going over everything from kind of the Buddhist history to the basic teachings and some foundations of meditation. We talk about things like the life and times of the Buddha, including his life before enlightenment and after he went and became a teacher. We talk about things like the role of women in Buddhism and the complicated history of subjugation that women have faced. We also talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Noble Eightfold Path, and all of these kind of core teachings that can really benefit our practice. So that's OneMindDharma.com/intro. In what I think is a new announcement to this podcast, I may have announced it last time, we've had some interest and requests from people to do either a half-day long or a day-long online meditation retreat. And these have largely come from people who sit with us at the online group. But we're going to go ahead and do it. We have some interest. We have a handful of people signed up and willing to do it. The information's at onemindDharma.com/day, D-A-Y. And you can sign up, and there's a little survey you'll get. You can take it or not. But to help us figure out what days of the week would be useful and whatnot. As always, you can visit patreon.com/oneminddharma. That's patreon.com/oneminddharma. It's a great way to support this podcast. I know a lot of people on different platforms support us. We're growing the Patreon, and it's very helpful to us to see. As I always say, most, if not all of this money every month goes directly back into One Mind Dharma. Usually into either fixing something, some technical issues, taking out little advertisements for our online course, paying our bills with One Mind Dharma. That's patreon.com/onemindDharma. We're getting pretty close to our first bill, our first goal, and our first bill. It is our first bill to cover the daily inspirational emails and the podcast emails. But we're getting close to the first goal, which is exciting. We're thinking about adding another one in there to take all ads off our YouTube videos, as we get lots of complaints about those, but it is one way we support ourselves. So visit that, and I'll leave it there for this week. So this week I'm actually revisiting a talk that I gave at the One Mind Dharma Center in Petaluma before we turned it over to the community and it became Mindful Petaluma. And this is the topic, which I don't know why I lead into the topic when it's the title of the episode, but it's renunciation and what this really means and how we can investigate it, especially as lay people. As far as I know, we don't have very many monastic listeners to this podcast. So especially as lay people, what does it look like to investigate this teaching on renunciation? I also want to say that for some of us, the teaching on renunciation and where we find it to be useful and most kind of fruitful is by taking up robes, becoming a monk or a nun. So let's just start with the basics. Renunciation is part of wise intention. It's one of the wise intentions that we can have, this factor on the Noble Eightfold Path. There's a great word in Pali, nekama, which means the pleasure of renunciation. And I think it's important because we can Often we think of this word renunciation and we lose sight of the pleasure or freedom that can come from it. The Buddha described renunciation as to go forth from lust. This non-attachment, this not clinging to things. There's a hindrance here, the attachment to sensual desire, to pleasing our sense doors, something we like feeling or smelling or tasting or hearing or thinking. Ooh, missed one. So, it could be something like food or drugs and alcohol, or maybe the amount of things that we purchase or own. But it's important to recognize that this kind of translation of to go forth from lust and to find pleasure in renunciation doesn't mean just white knuckling it. It doesn't mean we kind of, stop something and are really kind of stricken by some pain over it. I compare it to quitting smoking cigarettes, that at first there's not a ton of pleasure in it. And there's also not a ton of renunciation. There's that white knuckling, that removing it from my life, and it's very unpleasant and full of craving, and I'm not free from lust. But as time goes on, I begin to experience some freedom in not experiencing that craving. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Tan Jeff says, "What sort of sacrifices are intelligent?" The Buddhist answer to this question resonates with an American principle. An intelligent sacrifice is any in which you gain a greater happiness by letting go of a lesser one, in the same way you give up a bag of candy if offered a pound of gold. In other words, an intelligent sacrifice is like a profitable trade. This analogy is an ancient one in the Buddhist tradition. "I'll make a trade," one of the Buddha's disciples once said. Aging for the ageless, burning for the unbound, the highest peace, the unexcelled safety from bondage. There's something in all of us that would rather not give things up. We'd prefer to keep the candy and get the gold. But maturity teaches us that we can't have everything, that to indulge in one pleasure often involves denying ourselves another, perhaps better one. Thus, we need to establish clear priorities for investing our limited time and energies where they'll give us the most lasting returns. So I love this kind of straightforward explanation and kind of look at it. And it's one of the things I love about Thanissaro Bhikkhu and Tan Jeff, whichever you prefer to call him by, is he has a deep understanding of the suttas and Buddhist teachings, but also has a way of putting things in terms that make sense to me or kind of land. And it's a great way to look at renunciation. Although we may not want to give up this or that, or we may not want to renounce it, we do so because we have some faith or confidence that some sort of, I don't know if greater joy is the right term, as it can be, that can be kind of judgmental, but some more wholesome, more freeing joy can come from it. One of the things that happened to me surrounding renunciation is, as I began learning about this teaching and sitting on meditation retreats, I had this experience of some kind of urgency or like a white light kind of epiphany moment of how much I cling to things. There's a great word in Pali, samvega, and it means just this kind of shock or dismay and sense of spiritual urgency. And it can actually really serve us in a way. Those moments when we have that sense of spiritual urgency, the samvega, we can use it to begin to investigate our relationship with clinging and craving and the things we have around us. So I broke this talk up into a couple little pieces, starting with the why. Why renunciation? Of course, we already kind of touched into some greater joy that we can experience. Verse 290 of the Dhammapada says, "If by giving up a lesser happiness, one could experience greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater." And I think that This can be seen as a deep Dharma kind of practice, like in meditation and in kind of investigation and insight, but it can also be incredibly pragmatic. Part of the piece there, though, is we don't always know the greater happiness that can come from renunciation. And at first, there needs to be some sort of faith or confidence or trust in the path or your teacher or your intuition. And once we begin to experience this freedom or the greater happiness as it's translated in the Dhammapada, then it comes more easily each time. As we begin to experience the freedom over and over again, we begin to perhaps turn toward it with more ease. The truth is that everything's impermanent. Craving causes suffering, partly because everything we experience is in a state of flux. So when we cling to things, it really just sets us up for suffering. We know that craving or clinging or attachment or greed is one of the three poisons, one of the chief causes of suffering. Renunciation is a way to counteract this, to really take action against greed and attachment. Bhikkhu Bodhi says, contemplating the dukkha inherent in desire is one way to incline the mind to renunciation. Another way is to contemplate directly the benefits flowing from renunciation. To move from desire to renunciation is not, as might be imagined, to move from happiness to grief, from abundance to destitution. It's a pass from gross entangling pleasures to an exalted happiness and peace, from a condition of servitude to one of self-mastery. Desire ultimately breeds fear and sorrow, but renunciation gives fearlessness and joy. So whether or not you read Bhikkhu Bodhi's books, or you trust him, or you believe him, these are kind of powerful promises. It's not moving from abundance to destitution or from happiness to grief. It's moving from some gross entangling pleasures to an exalted happiness and peace, to self-mastery, to fearlessness and joy. These are great promises of kind of, they offer some hope to me when I hear them. But I think that the first couple kind of lines or piece is really important as well, and we shouldn't lose sight in it. Contemplating dukkha in desire is one way to incline the mind to renunciation. So let's reflect on this for a moment. Can we look at the desire and craving and clinging and see how it's creating dukkha or dissatisfaction in our lives? It creates this sense of self. Obviously, everything that we cling to is impermanent and in a state of flux or change and won't last. So we know that if we cling too hard to something, we're going to lose it and suffer over it. But even before that, when we cling or crave too much, we can cause suffering for ourselves in that moment. The other way to contemplate is to contemplate directly the benefits flowing from renunciation. And that's where he goes on to talk about these kind of promises. I don't know if they're promises, but these benefits that we may experience. So it's important to actually contemplate these things. These aren't just, oh, that's a great idea and I'm going to move on from it. When we left the United States, it's hard to describe the process, but basically we had to decide kind of three piles. One is sell or donate, like totally get rid of. One is bring with us as we move out of the country, and we could only bring a couple suitcases. And the other one was to put in storage. And it was a really deep practice in renunciation and in investigating the clinging and craving. Elizabeth, my wife, was fantastic with it, but I like to cling to things that have sentimental value, but are ultimately useless and I never look at. I'm the kind of person who puts something in a box saves a bunch of little weird things that have some sort of value. We put them in a box, and then 5 years later we move, and I see it in the box, and I'm like, oh, that's cool, and I have a moment of joy over it. But as we were moving, it was time to investigate, like, what's worth keeping and what's worth not. And can I let go of these things and be okay? What ended up happening was we moved with just a couple suitcases each of what was important to us. And that's still all we have. We haven't been back to my parents, who are storing our stuff very generously for us. We haven't, gone back to the people we sold things to and asked for them back. And we haven't purchased a ton here to replace what we did have. And I'm talking everything from clothes to pictures to books to kitchen stuff to mats and rugs. What ended up happening was we experienced this level of, and there are things we absolutely crave or miss, but in general, we ended up experiencing this sort of forced renunciation or freedom from not having to worry about all these things. We also didn't have a car to worry about. And these kind of simplicity, the joy that comes from simplicity. So I want to talk, switching from why, to talk about actually how and what it looks like to put renunciation into practice or move toward it. I'm going to start with a quote from Pema Chodron. When we sit in meditation, we feel our breath as it goes out, and we have some sense of willingness just to be open to the present moment. Then our minds wander off into all kinds of stories and fabrications and manufactured realities, and we say to ourselves, it's thinking. We say that with a lot of gentleness and a lot of precision. Every time we're willing to let the storyline go, and every time we're willing to let go at the end of the out-breath, that's fundamental renunciation. Learning how to let go of holding on and holding back. So, as with a lot of the quotes I choose to read, they're not, beautiful, succinct one-liners or whatever. But I think that this is, the point here is that just by practicing, we're really working with renunciation on, I wouldn't even say a subtle level, on a fundamental level, as Pema Chodron says. When we work with the breath, we're learning to let it go in every moment. We're kind of retraining the mind and the experience. I think that the first thing that comes up for me on the how is mindfulness practice. I wrote about this in a post, What's the Purpose of Meditation, on our blog maybe 4 years ago now, that people come to meditation for all kinds of reasons and have all kinds of maybe a catalyst in their life that pushes them toward it, or suffering often. But people have asked over the years, what's the purpose of meditation actually? And everyone may have their own reasons, but as far as the Buddhist suttas are concerned, the purpose of mindfulness practice is to observe the 3 marks of existence: the dukkha, the not self, the impermanence. So I think that mindfulness practice, when done, I don't want to say right, but when done with effort, when done with some continuity and consistency or some understanding, can really help us to begin this process of renunciation through really contemplating and understanding these 3 marks of existence. When we really see impermanence clearly and dukkha clearly, and begin to get a kind of bigger look, or a better look at the bigger picture, the renunciation comes with less, we don't have to grapple over it, I think. And as I say this, I'm not perfect. Obviously, I cling to things. I am attached, I crave, I have greed. So I don't want to come off or not kind of name my own piece there. But overall, as we practice this, the renunciation comes with less difficulty or less of a fight, I think, in my experience. I also think that as far as meditation practice goes, metta or gentleness, this loving kindness practice can help. We begin to respond with without such reactivity. And the gentleness allows us to kind of touch into things without just, clinging out of habit. And on that note, compassion can also help. What do we do when we notice that suffering around clinging, or it's time to let go of something and we're suffering deeply? Compassion can help us touch into that suffering and discomfort, and then we can work with renunciation. The one thing I will say that can be beneficial, and I've noticed when working with renunciation in my own life and practice, is to make some effort to actually notice where attachment arises in your practice. Where do you begin clinging or craving? And it may not be, I'm craving something really unhealthy in this moment. Maybe it's more of in the line of spiritual materialism. I'm really craving a concentrated sit. Or I had it this morning in my sitting. I sit outside and I was doing metta practice, and I was relatively concentrated and collected and at ease. And then for whatever reason, the mind kind of fell into restlessness and worry. It was kind of over-energized and not contained. And I could really clearly sense that I was craving and clinging to how the mind was just a few breaths ago or a few phrases ago. So to really notice where the kind of attachment or clinging or grasping comes up. In daily life, something really pragmatically you can do, other than noticing where this attachment arises, is see if you can give something up. See if you can practice renunciation. And I'm not talking about starting with, giving up the biggest kind of vice in your life or doing anything harmful to yourself. But just seeing if you can give up something maybe that you found isn't wholesome or helpful for you, yet you still engage in. Maybe you can give up hitting the snooze button an extra time. Or maybe you can give up, not recycling or whatever it is, something that's not too charged, but to investigate what it's like to give it up with some mindfulness and this intention of renunciation. I had a teacher, and I've told this story many times, so I apologize, but I had a teacher a long time ago who told me to not listen to anything while I drove, and I commuted for work from, I think at the time I was driving from West LA down to Newport Beach. I think a little over an hour. And for a month, I wasn't allowed to listen to anything while I drove. And I often listened to, music or a podcast or the news or whatever, and to investigate what that's like. And I found it very hard. I found it very difficult. There was a lot of clinging and craving, and it was again like a forced renunciation in a sense, because I was the instruction was coming from the outside. But it is really a great practice to investigate with these little things. Do I have the power to work with this discomfort of wanting to turn on the radio or whatever it is? The other thing we should be doing is contemplating the 5 reflections. I certainly don't reflect on these every day. Every time, such as when I was preparing this talk, they come into my awareness. I get really diligent and I try to reflect on them every day, and then for some reason the effort wears off. But there were 5 reflections the Buddha said that we should reflect upon every day. 1, I have not gone beyond aging. 2, I have not gone beyond illness. 3, I am sure to die. I cannot avoid death. 4, I will grow different, separate from all that is dear to me. And 5, I'm the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do for good or for evil, to that I will fall heir. So 1, 2, and 3 are aging, illness, and death. These kind of heavenly messengers in Buddhist teachings. 4 is this, I will grow different, separate from all that is dear to me, this impermanence of everything. And 5 is the karma, that we're in charge of our own actions. But what these reflections can do is help us to see that everything's impermanent and begin to let go a little bit, even if we don't mean them or really understand them or really like with them at first. In the Anguttara Nikaya, it reads, "There is the case of the person who has abandoned passion, desire, fondness, thirst, fever, and craving for sensuality. Then he comes down with a serious disease. As he comes down with the serious disease, the thought does not occur to him, 'Oh, those beloved sensual pleasures will be taken from me, and I will be taken from them.' He does not grieve, is not tormented, does not weep, beat his breast, or grow delirious. This is a person who, subject to death, is not afraid or in terror of death." So as with many things in the suttas, these are high bars to set for ourselves, to die without any terror or fear, to not weep or grieve or be tormented in any way. And to be quite honest, I have never had a near-death experience. I don't want to pretend like I know how I would feel. But this is one of the kind of an illustration of the benefit of renunciation and this reminder that we leave this world regardless of what your beliefs are, for the most part, about the afterlife or reincarnation, or if you believe that when you die, you're dead. We leave this world with, at the very best, we won't leave with everything that we cling to. At the very best, I don't think that many people would argue that your savings account will be there waiting for you in the afterlife. So these things that we cling to and these things that we kind of hold on to, they're to really recognize that they're impermanent, to really make this a point of investigation in our own lives. I think that renunciation can be a really difficult thing as we begin to contemplate the impermanence and the relationships in our lives. And sometimes there's that sense of samvega, that sense of urgency. I have had it in my own life where it's kind of this like, oh my gosh, I am clinging so hard to this right now. I need to let it go. But sometimes that pushing away or letting go is just an aversion to the discomfort we're experiencing. So I encourage you to really bring some compassion and loving kindness as you investigate renunciation and what it is like to let go of something without pushing it away. There's that great Ajahn Chah story of he had his favorite cup. I think Jack Kornfield tells it in one of his books. I'll probably get corrected on that, and that's okay. That Ajahn Chah had a cup that he always drank out of, a mug perhaps, and he always drank out of it. He always had it at meals as his favorite, and people kind of were like whispering about his clinging and attachment. And one day he knocked the cup over, and the cup just shattered on the ground. And someone said, "Aren't you unhappy or aren't you sad?" And Ajahn Chah replied, "The cup was always broken." It's beautiful kind of almost like a koan in a way, but there's this beautiful kind of sentiment of recognizing the impermanence and not grieving in that moment that it's gone. Renunciation doesn't mean we have to sell everything we own. It doesn't mean we have to get rid of everything necessarily. I like to think that it's actually more wholesome to practice a renunciation of the mind and heart than it is to practice a physical renunciation. If we get rid of everything we own and go into the woods, but we spend every waking moment just kind of clinging and grasping and thinking about our old things, that's not what renunciation's about. To really flip that script and look at it as a non-clinging or not holding on to the things and thoughts and emotions and experiences, to go forth from lust and find nikama, the pleasure of renunciation. So that's all I have. I'm going to renounce this Dharma talk. If you have something you want to hear about, a topic or a question, whether it's Dharma related or more pragmatic, email me, Matthew@OneMindDharma.com. We next week are going to talk about vulnerability and We'll have some Dharma in there, but I think, as you know, sometimes I like to go into the Buddhist teachings and kind of deeper Dharma here, and other times I like to investigate and balance it out with some pragmatic pieces. So, again, if you want to participate in a day long, they're going to be donation based. All are welcome. oneminddharma.com/day. Please consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/oneminddharma. One Mind Dharma has always been a passion project of mine. I spent a lot of time and energy on it. I went through years of training with Spirit Rock, and I would love one day to make One Mind Dharma more than just kind of a side project or passion project and dedicate more time to it. And as always, I have openings in my coaching. I think 2 right now. If you want to work one-on-one and investigate something in your life, I'm not a therapist, but I will be your Dharma or mindfulness coach. And with that, I will end this episode. I'm always reachable at Matthew@oneminddharma.com. You can visit us at oneminddharma.com, and please leave us a review. I'm not allowed to promise you anything if you leave us a review on whatever you're listening on, but I can promise you that I'll appreciate it. Thank you.